sparks fly as 3 Kansas Republicans battle it out for your support in the race for the U.S. Senate. Plus, the Kansas response to calls for social justice reform across the state, and from closing your city pool to trashing plans for expanding 2 state prisons, how the pandemic's budget crisis is affecting you and how long it might last. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. In the face of a looming $1.3 billion budget shortfall, the governor has said for months cuts will be coming. This week, we got a look at where those cuts might be, as I showed in this report on Cake News. In a state finance council meeting, the governor released this list of proposed cuts totaling some $682 million. They include delaying some $264 million in loan payments due this year and next, as well as cutting several new programs designed to begin with the new fiscal year in July, such as expanding the Winfield and Lansing prisons and school safety grants at the Department of Education, saving nearly $78 million. Finally, it calls for $40 million in unspecified cuts to other agencies. Supporters say this balances the budget for now, allowing lawmakers to decide what should happen in the long term. But opponents say the plan is just kicking the can down the road.
Across the board cuts are fair. Hiring freezes need to be enacted. We need every agency to look at the frills and see what they can do to cut.
Next year, it's up to us as legislators to actually make the long-term structural changes that need to be made. This is literally just to get us through till then.
And joining me on the desk this week, we have Dr. Jeff Jarman from the Elliott School of Communication at Wichita State University and John Wright with KQAM Radio News. Thank you both so much.
You're welcome.
This is something that's kind of interesting, is this argument over what kind of cuts we should be making right now. We know that there's a major deficit. The question is, do we make those cuts right now or not? The sooner we make them, the less painful they will be, correct?
Yeah, well, it depends on how you think the budget shortfall is going to get fixed, right? There's the immediate deficit that we have, and then projections for even greater deficits. And the game that they're playing right now really is trying to figure out, will there be additional federal stimulus money? If there is, we don't need to make painful cuts now. But if there isn't going to be federal dollars later, it means we've delayed enacting some cuts that we maybe need in the short term.
I had one lawmaker who's on the House Appropriations Committee telling me that if they don't make the cuts now and they have to make them later, we're talking 15 to 20% of the state's budget.
And where that's going to come from is going to come from education funds, it's going to come from another department. We've already seen what's happened financially and fiscally that impacted folks that are waiting on checks and had those funds withdrawn, and we've seen how that played out. It seems to me that there needs to be both sides of the aisle coming together looking for a solution instead of this back and forth, because the bottom line is the most vulnerable people are going to be hurt by these cuts, and if they make them early before this July 1st deadline, the better off the entire state would be. But it's going to be some hard choices for sure.
Yeah, this point about both sides coming together would be great, but in an election year, I mean, that's the dynamic that's out there. Nobody wants to make all those cuts with a primary and a general election coming and the hope for federal dollars.
And that's the thing.
That's right.
That's the thing, because if you're looking for Washington to do anything now, there's enough going on up there with the civil upheaval, and then they're looking at re-election as well. And the city of Wichita is looking for some kind of bailout because of lost revenue. So there's a mixed bag for the government to get involved.
But is there more of a will now than there was 6 months ago for federal aid?
Well, at the federal level, I mean, they have an election pressure as well, right? Do they want to be the member of Congress who voted against funding for city and state governments back in their home districts? Mm-hmm. And to your point, because if they don't, then these huge cuts to education, I mean, that's the best example. Mm-hmm. Schools half the year is over. There's not 15%. That's all teacher salary. And so they have an incentive in order to fund that after the election as well.
Yeah, I've worked in those schools when the order came halfway through, 2/3 of the way through the school year to cut 5% and 10%, and that was painful.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yeah.
I'm in the school district now, and in spring sports, it just didn't happen. And so now we're looking ahead to the fall, and a lot of questions, well, will we have fall sports? The kids are out there working hard, and there's no guarantee that anything's going to start on time, although I hear the Shrine Bowl is going to be happening, but anything else is still pretty much in the air. And who knows, by fall and we get into winter, we could see coronavirus 2.0.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, the state isn't alone in feeling the budget crunch that's going on. Between shortfalls and increases in coronavirus cases here in Sedgwick County, the city of Wichita has decided it won't be opening its pools and splash pads this year, as KSN's John Acebus shows us.
I go to this pool, and I went to this pool like a year ago. That's probably the last time I went.
Isabella Cordova has been going to the municipal
for years and years.
And it's going to be at least one more before she and her great-grandmother can go again.
Oh yeah, it's going to miss it. Sad.
This is how city pools will look for the rest of 2020. No water and maybe some leaves in the swimming lanes.
I feel it's real sad for the kids, especially in the summertime. They're not able to go to the swimming pools, release some energy.
Brooklyn was looking forward to swimming lessons this year and getting out of the house after being cooped up for months.
It just kind of really stinks that there's no pools open, that they can have those couple of hours to get some sun.
After asking the city for weeks if and when the pools will open, officials said today they don't anticipate that happening.
As we go through the budget process, we've got to figure out if it makes sense budgetarily to open up those pools this year, knowing that we have to cut over $11 million out of the budget.
The city also cites safety concerns, adding it's worried about a COVID-19 outbreak.
I'm probably going to go to my friend's pool.
So you're swimming.
Leaving families like the Wingulars figuring out where they can swim for the rest of the summer.
That is the goal.
And when we're talking about swimming pools, it's not just the cost of opening it up. With COVID, you've got to think of additional sanitation. You've got to think of they'll have fewer people in there because you've got to keep that social distancing available. A lot of extra costs to open those up at a time when finances are tight, to say the least.
It's extremely tight, and when kids in some neighborhoods haven't had a pool and had to travel south to Derby, it's extremely disheartening, and at the same time important to keep the kids energized and important because they're all cooped up and they're ready to get out of the house and do something. And water, they'll be ready to play under the hose like we did back in the day. So I just dated myself, but
I'm right there with you. The hose and the sprinkler, that's what I grew up with.
So, but it's a tough decision. But again, the City Aquatics plan does have a chance to play out. So that's the looking down the road a bit. I don't think it's kicking the can, but it's rather to be safe than sorry when the coronavirus is still out there and still going.
Yeah, this third point on the city's press release they put out about the long-term plan, the reality is there are going to be fewer pools and there will be new splash pads installed, and letting that plan work out, that's a part of what the goal is here. Yeah. It's tough. Boy, you get on Facebook, you can see when this came out, there are people, a lot of comments. People are really upset about this, but balancing the financial needs and the safety needs, it's understandable. I don't think this is surprising.
Well, and safety is a big deal right now. I mean, across the country, we're seeing spikes happening again. They had hoped that summer would kind of do like it does with the flu season and we'd be done with COVID for a little bit. That's not happening. No. You got Texas, you got Florida, you've got these, I believe Arkansas is the other one with these big spikes. And Kansas is now starting to spike as well. So there are definitely concerns there.
Yeah, COVID likes the heat, so we found that out. But the thing that we can do is socially distance, wash our hands, wear the mask, and no judgment. The data is going to tell the story, hospitalizations, the numbers, and unfortunately the death numbers also. And we've seen long-term care facilities, the numbers are just staggering. And so bottom line is do what you can for yourself and others to protect everyone that you love, to make it through this tough time. And then on the other side, we have new facilities coming up, as Dr. Jarman mentioned. And so we do have, there's light at the end of the tunnel, or there'll be water in the pool. So we just got to wait for it.
And we do have to remember the 1918 flu did not last for forever.
No.
Eventually we moved on.
That's right. I mean, I think this is a this summer problem. And the good news is there is a long-term plan in the city to deliver these kinds of services in the future summers.
So if everyone can just hang on, hang on.
By our fingernails.
Everybody by the poolside and just wait your turn to get in. Because we've seen Derby have a plan for their aquatic center, and that's worked reasonably well, although there were some things happening down there. But again, there is a plan in place. Let's trust the process, and of course, everyone do what they can to be responsible and safe.
Yeah, we don't want to end up where we're seeing Texas and Florida going with having to reclose some things.
Right.
Yeah. Well, there are other things going on as well. While trying to deal with the pandemic fallout, the state is also responding to demands for criminal justice reform in the wake of George Floyd's death in Minnesota. Corinne Griffith from KSN's Capitol Bureau shows us what a new state civil rights commission is hoping to accomplish.
In response to the death of George Floyd and the widespread protests that followed, Governor Kelly has created the Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. According to the governor, the goal of the 12-person commission is to develop and recommend policy changes that will create a lasting change for people of color in Kansas. John Nave, Executive Vice President of the Kansas AFL-CIO, says racial injustice is not new. It's just being recorded now.
I think I was a freshman in high school, and we got stopped by the police up there, and he detained us and asked us 110 questions.
Nave adds that he has had to have conversations with his children about how to interact with the police. He hopes this commission will change that conversation by developing laws on police training and what happens if an officer uses excessive force.
At the end of the day, they have to have accountability.
Anthony Lewis, superintendent of Lawrence Schools, says that police reform will likely be the first thing the commission takes action on. But he adds that other topics like equity in Kansas schools are also important. He says he wants the commission's work to have a long-term impact.
I want people to look back and say, you know, because of some decisions that we made in 2020, it will benefit people that are coming years after we're gone.
Other members of the commission represent the law enforcement, legal, and religious fields, and we will continue to keep you updated on the work of the commission. At the Capitol, I'm Corinne Griffith.
Certainly a lot of high hopes for this commission, but I'm also hearing from some folks who are saying this is just kind of a delaying tactic until everything dies down to make it look like we're doing something. How much energy, how much will is there to actually make changes this time around? John, you and I both have kind of been on this merry-go-round a few times.
Yes, we have, and we've seen the ebb and flow of this, and it seems like now there is obviously an ignition point with so many deaths and the notables that we've all seen and read about with the police deaths, folks at the hands of police, and it seems like this time it's catching a hold. It's time. 400 years, it's time. As far as the commission is concerned, it needs to be people of action on that commission. The time for talk is over. There needs to be some meaningful change in the list that was provided and put out by the city recently. The police department agreed to a number of changes, which really surprised me that how many agreements that the chief and the city agreed to. But then there's others that I heard an interesting theory. Let's try a pilot program and see how that goes. And of course, the policies and procedures, officers have to keep themselves safe, obviously. But it'd be interesting to see how a Department of Public Safety versus a police department would change things or improve things here in Wichita.
Yeah, I mean, certainly just you and I, but all three of us really know the power of words. Just a name change can change perception to a certain extent.
Yeah, you know, it is powerful changing a name because that's a part of culture. It gets embedded in training, but those things will take a lot of time. I guess to circle back to this commission, I agree that now seems a little different than prior efforts. I think it's important to have a commission, but it's obviously not the solution. The solution is, well beyond what this commission can do, but we need the spotlight on the issues. And I think the question is whether there's public appetite, finally, to make some of these changes. It seems like there is, but even public pressure is just one layer of that. We have to get legislators on board. We have to get police chiefs on board. I mean, we've got one who's making some changes, but we need them all to train officers and demand, really in many ways, culture change about how those policing tactics, play out on the street.
And particularly since we've seen what happened in Missouri just a few short time ago, the militarization with the vehicles that were surplus from the military, and all of a sudden the police departments had it. Well, that's an obvious sign, oh, we're going to hem in and fence you in, and you're not going to get out, especially if something breaks out. So that definitely needs to be changed. There's nothing wrong with having those in reserve for civil disobedience, if that's the case truly, but to have that in the shadow and over a community of color, it's very disarming, very threatening.
Certainly brings back some bad memories, to say, community-wide memories, to say the least.
Yeah.
I do want to go back to something you said about the change in will for change, the increased acceptance of the idea that we need to make changes at this point. How much of that would you say goes back to the increased pervasiveness of the internet in our lives, especially social media? Certainly there are a lot of these cases that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I, even as a journalist, never would have heard of.
Yes, social media and amazing cameras on our phones. You know, I mean, the ability to document now started, you know, as much with police body cams, the availability of that, and now just everyone outside can take photos, and the ability to see that now, to understand that now, to put in context how all of those things play out. That's powerful for people who, you know, mostly we don't see all of those things, and so the ability to capture those images, share them quickly on social media, really is the kind of thing that has given rise, I think, to public understanding of some of the worst problems that we're dealing with.
Issues that people of color have known for years were there.
And especially those who don't live in the neighborhood, and you see these on social media, you're going, the person who is not in my skin, your skin, oh, this really happens? In Wichita, it really happens, and it's like back in the 60s, Vietnam War, those images impacted the nation, changed the course of a president. So now is the modern day version of that with transparency, with cell phones, Wichita Police Department cams, and so it's happening, and the word I always use, it's now. It's a sudden impact, and it does jar. It's like a cold bucket of water in your face. Oh man, we've got to do something about this, and this does feel like a trigger point for change.
Yeah. Well, certainly we know from history, that's where my last degree is in, so I keep going back to that, but we know from history, from the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, that television cameras made a huge difference, and this is now putting the equivalent of those cameras in everybody's hands.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're a visual culture. Those images are powerful, and now instead of, you know, I think you were referencing single still images that are powerful now, to have minutes worth of material to provide the context that oftentimes was missing, lost, allowed people to fill in with a version of events that made sense to them. We now have that entire series of events, and that provides evidence to help people, I think, to your point, who didn't know. It's not that they disbelieved, they just didn't know to believe, and now they can.
Now they can, and then that's a flashpoint to get involved. Where do I go? Who do I talk to? What board do I get on? What committee to affect change if that sense moves them to action?
Yeah. Well, just to raise your hand and say, I agree, right? I mean, to build the public will so that legislators and other officials will make changes. That's really important.
Because honestly, they're not going to make changes until their reelection is endangered. We know that from U.S. history as well.
Yes, and
politicians don't change until they're forced to.
That's right, and there's already movement out there about a march to vote instead of a march in the street. So it's going to be a march to the polls, and COVID-19 is going to play a big role in there. Mail-in ballot, or will there be in-person voting? So we have yet to be seen.
Now, you both have kind of mentioned Chief Gordon Ramsay here in Wichita. He is on that statewide Civil Rights Commission, but he, as well as several members of the new Civil Rights Commission and members of the Wichita City Council this week, spoke releasing a city response to demands for change here in Wichita. That response is getting mixed reviews, though, as KSN's Hunter Funk shows us.
Positions to actually listen to our voices.
After demands for change from several advocacy groups, city leaders and the Wichita Police Department came out with a community response about their policing reforms.
The goal was to listen so that we could come with this first step as a response.
The WPD agreed with demands like revising its use of force policy to include more details about an officer's duty to intervene if there's wrongdoing by another officer. But officials wouldn't get on board with other demands like the defund police movement that pushes to put more money into social programs instead of police. The chief says officers are helping with those services.
More and more dealing with mental health issues in our community and homelessness, to the point where we've built teams of officers to help address these issues.
But now that, they've been transparent about some stuff, it actually has given us some knowledge about some tools and some resources that we actually do have in place because of WPD, and that actually makes us feel good.
The WPD says they agree with eliminating no-knock warrants unless violent crimes are involved or police deem them necessary. The WPD wouldn't support a push to allow the Citizens Review Board to have subpoena power as it investigates police officer conduct.
Those are subjects we definitely want to continue to talk about.
Well, this is just a start to the policing reforms. With plans for more discussion, Scott Jr. says he's happy to see the changes.
Coming together in unity, there is nothing that becomes impossible.
And a lot of things in that city response, John, are many of the same things that the chief was saying when he was here on this show with us a couple of weeks ago.
Correct. And you have to give them credit in, one, embracing the community for change, because the chief could have said, oh, no, we know what we're doing, we're good. But at least that effort was made, the olive branch was made. It was more than just the cookout that they had over at the park at McAdams Park a while back. And that even took some criticism on social media. But now we can actually see in black and white what the police department agrees with, the policies that they're wanting to change. The Citizens Review Board is what's most interesting to me. The subpoena power would be powerful. I'm sure there'll be some pushback on police unions, but that is one thing that the citizens probably need, because the force of the government and the city's already behind the police department. The only option for citizens is the vote. So why not have that Citizens Review Board have some sort of subpoena power? It'd be worth checking out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. I guess before I say too much, maybe I should disclose my wife is an attorney for the city, and she gives legal advice to the police. So be fair about that. But the thing that strikes me about this is that the effort that the police made to go to the community, to even bother to gather feedback, to solicit ideas, and then the time to write a response and to accept some of those. We don't see that in police departments across the country right now. They're a lot more reluctant to engage the public. So in terms of willingness to engage, lots of good there. And some of the specific policies that they're going to roll back and not use, the increased demands on officers to intervene, the duty to intervene that they're discussing, those are really positive steps. And I guess here's the hope, maybe, that we don't need subpoena power for a citizen review board. If we can eliminate some of the worst practices, we wouldn't need those. Wouldn't that be great? We don't need a citizen review board.
That would be really good, because that would be a big shift from prior departments. And I'm going to watch, I don't want to step on any toes, because the friends of mine are still out there on the police department who have been in that police chief's chair. And the time, as we mentioned earlier, is now for some sort of change. And it's good to see that the Chief Ramsey and the department is making an effort.
Okay, well, we've got one more thing to talk about. And it doesn't have to do with civil rights or COVID-19 or state budgets or any of all that. Turning to national politics going on here in Kansas, 3 Republicans vying for their party's nomination to the U.S. Senate went head-to-head in Wichita this week. It didn't take long for sparks to fly at the debate, as I showed you in this report on Cake News. This was the 3rd time these men faced each other on a debate stage as they fight for your vote for Senate. With the very first question, former Secretary of State Chris Kobach took a jab at Congressman Roger Marshall over his stance on immigration.
Why in the world would you want 83,000 more H-2B workers to come in and compete with Americans for those jobs?
And for Marshall to hit back at Kobach's electability.
I will always support the president's policy on immigration. But what the real issue is making sure that we send a candidate to the general election that can beat Barbara Bollier.
Both pushing to reach those still undecided voters in a tight race. In a debate centered around health care and COVID-19, retired NFL player and KC businessman Dave Lindstrom had his own point to make, while firing his own shots at both Kobach and Marshall.
I'd like to talk about term limits. I'd like to talk about not career politicians, not wannabe career politicians, That's what I'd like to talk about.
All three agreed it would be hard to work with Democrats in the current political climate. The state needs expanded broadband access to make telehealth more available and cut health care costs, and that wearing a mask should be a personal choice. And I have to say, I've covered a lot of debates. This was probably one of the most interesting at a state level. Definitely a lot of charges lobbed back and forth. Really kind of a sign of how tight the race is.
Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly what this is. It's a very close race. You worry about how, people's willingness to go to the polls, getting voter turnout. The issues that are here are personal in a sense, so it's not surprising to see those things get a little more heated than might otherwise be the case.
And they're going to split their platforms to attract a different base. There has to be more than just the Republican base. They've got to attract people of color. They've got to attract those who maybe are on the fence. Oh, maybe the Republican is not that bad, someone who's an independent, or perhaps a Democrat that wants to switch parties. So they're going to have to embrace something to jump into the lead of this race, because it's going to be tight.
Oh yeah, it's definitely going to be tight. I mean, it's an interesting question whether any of those candidates could create the kind of broad coalition that you just described. But electability, clearly one of the issues that, I mean, in terms of making this a heated and I don't know, nasty is maybe too strong of a word here, but you know what I mean? The thing that hangs over Kobach is his most recent loss in the governor's race, and that and every time you bring that up, that hits hard, and so I think that's the kind of thing that amps that debate up.
Well, John, Jeff, thank you both so much for joining me this week. I've enjoyed our discussion, and thank you as well. We'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, Cake News, and KSN News for sharing their work with us. If you'd like to continue the conversation, find us on social media. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8. For now, stay safe and have a great week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.